When I was growing up, I wondered why my parents not only changed where we lived, but also changed my name twice. I found out about this when I turned 18. After taking several deep breaths, and with a tear glistening in her left eye, my mother said, "Brandon, that was my name back then. I need to tell you why some things have happened in your life, including name changes." I've always been curious about the name change, first at age 6 from Tom Simpson to Kevin Harris, and then at age 11 from Kevin Harris to Brandon Bolter, but since neither parent ever wanted to talk about it, I didn't bring it up. Topic for many years. "I'm very interested to know, Mom," I replied. After another sigh and a second tear, Mom continued, "When you were 6 years old, I testified in court about what some bad people had done. Federal prosecutors feared that the lives of our family members might be in danger, so we were included in a witness protection program known as WITSEC. We changed our names and locations immediately after the trial. When you were 11, the U.S. Marshal in charge of us became concerned that we might have been exposed, and we had to change our identities and locations a second time." "Is the threat still real?" I asked. "Probably not, as the Marshals believe that the organization I testified against is virtually non-existent, having been relentlessly targeted by federal and state authorities for the past 12 years. However, your father, Sister Melissa, and I probably will stay in witness protection until Melissa turns 18, just to be sure. As you head off to college and start your adult life, we wanted you to be aware of the situation," she continued. We talked for about another half hour, and as we were wrapping up, I surprised myself by asking, "Do you have my birth certificate for Tom Simpson?" Mom went to the safe in her bedroom and came back with my birth certificate in the name of Tom Simpson, the original Social Security card, perfect Social Security cards, and fake birth certificates in the names of Kevin Harris and Brandon Bolter, and several other documents. When she handed them to me, she grinned. "You already have documents for 2 aliases, but don't use them unless you're planning on escaping a bad relationship." I opened a safe deposit box at the National Bank and put all the documents in there, as well as my state champion javelin medal from high school. Over the next month, my conversation with my mother forced me to grapple with a number of issues that had bothered me as a child, including the rather secluded upbringing Melissa and I had had, the anxiety my parents felt when I insisted on joining the track team at high school, their reluctance to be photographed so that the photos would not leave our house, and many other small and large oddities that arose in my childhood. Although I gained some self-confidence from athletics and decent grades, it was probably because of my troubled childhood that I did not have the self-confidence that a 182 cm, 79 kg good-looking guy should have. This included an aversion to physical confrontations. Other characteristics I had: I didn't like real team sports like football, fast cars, and other typical male hobbies, and I liked plays, especially musicals, opera, and art. By the time I graduated from college, my parents and sister had been out of the witness protection program for a year, since the organization that posed the threat no longer existed. But of course, we all retained the Bolter family name and identity. After college, I started dating a woman I met at a singles meeting named Jill Gerson. We seemed pretty compatible, except that Jill exuded confidence, and I still lacked that trait. Later, as I got to know Jill better, I realized that she really had an explosive temper. It didn't put me off, but it did make me a little wary. However, Jill's sex appeal ultimately overrode any doubts I had about the relationship. Jill and I got married in front of a justice of the peace, with only our parents and siblings present. Neither of us wanted a big celebration. We went on a short honeymoon to Niagara Falls, where we barely left our room. Married life with Jill was good for 2 years. We made love regularly, had a good group of friends, visited every art gallery and museum in the area, and spent a significant portion of our spare money on the theater. However, after about 26 months of marriage, Jill began to have physical problems. At first, her menstrual cycles became irregular, something that had never happened to her before. Then, a milky substance would sometimes be released from her breasts. I insisted that she see a doctor. Luckily, the first doctor Jill saw turned out to be an expert in his field, because after 2 consultations over the next few days and several tests, Dr. Gilbert diagnosed a benign growth on Jill's pituitary gland called hyperprolactinemia. Because it was caught early, there was no permanent damage and treatment was relatively simple. Dr. Gilbert prescribed a dopamine agonist to be taken 3 times daily, then tapered to twice daily after 2 months, and then to once daily after another month. The treatment was almost miraculous. Within 6 weeks, she was back to her normal self. After 8 weeks, she seemed even better, at least sexually, as we had some form of sex almost every day, including when she had regular periods. I was so pleased with the improvement in my sex life and the accompanying passion that some things I would normally notice probably escaped my notice. These things included Jill sometimes putting a pair of panties in her purse when she left for work, a second phone that I sometimes noticed in our guest room, and not being able to reach her at lunchtime much more often than usual. One morning, after a normal night of passionate lovemaking, I was more attentive than usual and saw her discreetly put a pair of panties and a strange phone in her handbag, and unable to reach her at lunchtime, I finally suspected that something was wrong. Toward the end of my lunch break, I drove 10 minutes from my office to Jill's office and waited outside. Around 1:30 p.m., I saw her being driven to her office by a man in a BMW. The kiss on the lips they exchanged before she jumped out of the car disturbed me. When she returned home that night, I deliberately, in a joking manner, looked at her panties. They were the same color that I saw in the morning when she put them in her purse. Now on guard, I watched Jill more closely. When I again saw her sneaking a pair of panties and a second phone into her purse 2 mornings later, I was there at her office at 11:30 the next day. At 11:54 a.m., I saw the same BMW I had seen earlier pull up in front of the building. Jill quickly exited the building and got into the car, and they drove away. I easily followed them in my nondescript white Toyota, which looked like hundreds of other cars on the road at the time. I followed the BMW for only a few miles before it turned into the driveway of a detached house located at least 50 feet from neighbors on either side. After Jill and her friend got out of the car, they kissed and then walked to the front door, he with his hand on her buttocks, she with a smile on her face. I parked on the street in front of the house, got out, and knocked on the door. The man who answered the door was much larger than me and obviously did not appreciate my knocking. "What do you want?" he barked. I saw Jill in the background. She looked at me and at least had the decency to blush. "I want to talk to your bitch friend, you asshole," I barked back and tried to enter. He pushed me to the ground, and when I stood up, he hit me. It was painful. "Get off my property or I'll kick your ass," he shouted. Jill was nowhere to be seen. Still avoiding confrontation at this point, I trudged back to my car, went home to patch up my nose and gather the things I'd need for the next few days, and drove back to the office. I turned off my cell phone, but saw that there was a message from Jill's main phone. I didn't check it. At work, I asked the HR person in charge of providing temporary housing for out-of-town clients if I could use one of my firm's 3 apartments for the next week or so. She checked the schedule and said one of the apartments was available, but I needed to get approval from one of the vice presidents. I got approval by lying that my house had a bad fumigation experience and moved into the apartment that night. That night, I considered my situation. I was embarrassed by my physical encounter with Jill's lover and wondered why I avoided confrontation and what the root of my lack of self-confidence was. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't like what I saw. Cute weakling. This is where my old personality ended. I made it through Friday fine, and on Saturday I signed up for a week-long course called Impact Self-Defense. The course lasted only 1 week and did not involve learning karate or MMA, but surviving in a fight. He taught 8 proven effective techniques that, if mastered, greatly increase the likelihood of surviving, even winning in a fight. By the following Saturday, I was bruised, sore, and brimming with confidence. I realized that these 8 techniques, very different and simple, would probably not win a fight against a skilled attacker. However, I had no doubt that for the average male antagonist, at least one of the techniques would be very successful and unexpected. I was especially confident in the header technique that was taught to me, and which my instructor said I had almost mastered, including how to successfully maneuver to use it. During the week while I was training, Jill tried to contact me several times, including at work. I successfully avoided her. However, I started listening to her voicemails and reading her texts. They started out a little sarcastic, became more conciliatory, and 9 days after I left, I received one message that stuck with me. It was said with real emotion and sounded like this: "Please call Dr. Gilbert and let her explain my medical situation. Please, if you ever loved me, do this." I called Dr. Gilbert. She was busy with a patient, but called me back within an hour. "Hey, Brandon," she greeted me when I answered my cell phone. "Jill has given me permission to tell you about her condition." "I'm interested to hear," I answered sincerely. "The dopamine agonist I prescribed for her sometimes causes an unusual side effect. I warned her about it, but either she didn't listen or didn't realize the effect it was having on her. It causes an almost irresistible urge to have sex. Have you noticed an increase in sexual activity, aggression on her part over the past few months?" asked Dr. Gilbert. "Yes, I noticed," was my answer. "This is a side effect of the medication, made worse by the fact that instead of reducing the dose to twice a day after 2 months, and then to once a day after another month, she continued to take it 3 times a day. Last week, when she came to I apparently after you left her because of her sexual promiscuity, I changed the dopamine agonist and insisted that she take it only 6 times a week, no more. I believe that now she will be able to control her sexual desires, and I hope you can rebuild your life," she continued. I thanked her and started having a serious conversation again. I decided to meet with Jill and see if I could overcome her betrayal, since my wedding vows included in sickness and in health. The next day, Wednesday, after work, I collected my things from the company's apartment, called the cleaning service that serviced it to inform them that I was moving out, and went to our apartment. I was hoping that Jill's reaction would be such that I could justify giving her another chance, but I hadn't made a final decision yet. When I entered our apartment around 19, using my key, I saw her making out on the sofa with that asshole from BMW, with his hand under her skirt. At least she looked embarrassed. "You're still sleeping with the asshole, as far as I can see," I barked. "Brandon, I wasn't expecting you. My new medication regimen hasn't kicked in yet. We can get through this," were the words I think I heard her say, although I can't be sure because I was furious. The asshole was aggressive. He grabbed Jill's hand and said, "Come on, Jill, let's leave this loser and come to my house." "The only way you're leaving here is on a stretcher," I barked. "Why, you little coward," he barked back and moved towards me the same way he did on his porch. I think I heard Jill scream in the background, but I can't be sure because I was concentrating on the asshole and remembering exactly how to execute the perfect header. As the asshole began his strike, I moved forward, crouched as I had been taught, and in a fluid motion lifted the top of the skull, supposedly the hardest part of the body, up into his chin, squeezing his neck upon contact. It worked perfectly. The asshole fell to the floor unconscious. Although I stopped, I ignored Jill as I packed our 2 largest suitcases with everything I thought I'd need, then took my old-school spear out of the closet and left. Jill was busy being an asshole, but she stood up and tried to stop me, begging me to talk to her. But I didn't listen. As I pulled out of the parking lot, an ambulance pulled in from the other end. I drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, paid cash, and made plans for the next day. Afraid that the police might show up at my office, I quit over the phone, angering my boss. I went to our bank, withdrew all the money from the accounts, and took everything from my safe, including birth certificates, social cards, and other documents in the names of Kevin Harris and Tom Simpson. Over the next week, I got a new driver's license in the name of Kevin Harris, canceled my cell phone contract, recycled my phone without a SIM card, bought a temporary phone, sold my car for cash, and bought a cheaper car that I registered in Kevin Harris' name. As I left the area around noon, heading to a city about 1,000 miles away, I committed one last act. I parked a block from the asshole's house. On UP's form, I rang the doorbell to make sure no one was home. I left the package I wanted to deliver on the porch and walked back to the car. I changed into another suit and took a spear with a highly flammable material at the tip. I walked to a spot about 175 feet from the asshole's window. I assembled the spear, set the material on fire, and threw it straight at the window. Then I quickly returned to the car. I waited 5 minutes until I saw 2 fire trucks. As I drove past the burning house, it looked like it might burn to the ground, although by then both cars were already filling it with water and foam. I continued driving towards my new home. I never contacted or heard from Jill again, not surprising since Brandon Bolter was now a ghost. I heard from my parents that she contacted them, but they claimed that they did not know where I was. She told them that she had hired a private detective and that the police suspected that I had committed arson. But since my new documents were practically bulletproof, I was not worried about being found. Just in case, I communicated with my parents and sister only on temporary phones purchased specifically for this purpose. I found out that starting a new life is not easy, even if you have legal documents. The problem was the resume. I put one together based on Brandon Bolter's background and hoped that no potential employer would check me out. I included a cover letter explaining that my records were destroyed in a fire and only applied to places that did not require a background check. A month later, and after an interview, which I passed with flying colors because I was tasked with writing documents that I should be familiar with if I had said experience, I found a job similar to the previous one. She was at a slightly lower level, but with opportunities for advancement and a more than decent salary. I had barely dated for nearly 10 months and didn't have enough income to attend all the musicals or art shows I wanted when fate smiled on me. I had just been promoted and started working with clients face-to-face. A more experienced employee referred me to a woman named Joan Green, with whom he was not getting along, and I had my first meeting with her. I found her more charming than problematic, and after our business was over, I invited her to dinner. Joan piqued my interest when she said, "One of my greatest passions is musicals, but I can never get my husband Horace to go with me. I went a few times with friends, but none of them were as passionate about them as I was, and I didn't have as much fun as I had hoped." "You're kidding," I chuckled. "I love musicals. I wish my economic situation would allow me to go to them or other shows, or at least to art exhibitions every week." Joan seemed surprised that a 26-year-old heterosexual man could be such a fan, so she began jokingly asking me about my interests. When, during our discussions, she learned that I was not only very familiar with relatively modern musicals such as Hamilton, The Phantom of the Opera, Les Miserables, and Cats, but also with old and sometimes even obscure productions such as Brigadoon, Annie Get Your Gun, and Finian's Rainbow, she was very impressed. Our lunch lasted 40 minutes longer than it should have, but we both enjoyed it. She said goodbye with a hug and a sparkle in her eyes. I was so busy that I almost forgot about meeting Joan Green when she called me about a month later. After exchanging pleasantries and settling a business matter, Joan said, "Listen, Kevin, my husband Horace and I would like to invite you to dinner this Friday. Are you free?" I was surprised and instinctively replied, "Of course." "You can bring a companion if you want," she continued. "I don't think I'll be able to find anyone this weekend," I chuckled. "No problem. Can you meet us at La Petite Maison at 7:30 p.m. on Friday?" "Looking forward to it," I replied. I asked a few colleagues about La Petite Maison, since I was relatively new in town and hadn't heard of it. Everyone reacted with envy. "This is the most exclusive restaurant in the city. It has 2 Michelin stars, and it is almost impossible to get a table there," said the most knowledgeable colleague. I was stunned. On Friday evening, I came in my best suit. I thought I looked good. Fortunately, Joan and Horace were already there when I arrived, for, despite my best attire, I was afraid that I would not be allowed in for lack of respectability. The place wasn't really pretentious, but it served some of the best food of its type I've ever had. I noticed that my menu didn't have prices. I still tried to order something that I thought was relatively economical. Horace was a friendly guy who turned out to be the coup of a Fortune 1000 company. My impression that he had a lot of money was reinforced when he didn't even look at the bill and simply handed the waiter a black Amex card. It turned out that I was invited to dinner for a reason, and it seemed to me that it was like an interview. I found out the reason the following Monday when Horace called me at work and asked if I could take Joan to the opera the following Saturday, which he didn't like. I stuttered, but agreed and promised to call Joan to make arrangements. Joan was glad to hear from me. I hope it is not too much of a burden for a handsome young man like you to accompany an old woman like me to the opera. No, I'd be honored, and you're not old. I'll be jealous of every guy there, I replied, causing Joan to laugh. I don't think I could ever afford it myself, I added enthusiastically. Joan's driver picked me up from my apartment an hour before the show started. Then we picked Joan up. She looked really good. We arrived at the theater on time. I was in shock when we were ushered into a private box directly above and to the left of the stage. It was the best seat I've ever had in a theater in my life. The main plot, so to speak, is that an Egyptian police team ends up in a small Israeli town. The musicians wait in the cafe and start talking to the locals, and the singing and dancing begins. The play was unexpectedly entertaining, and Joan and I both enjoyed it. Afterwards, we went to a cast party, another first for me, and it was even more fun than the musical. Joan and I exchanged a big hug, both with genuine smiles on our faces, as her driver left her at the door before he took me home. Even though there was not an ounce of romance or sex in it, it was one of the 20 most enjoyable events of its kind that I have ever experienced. Joan and Horace had many friends as well as contacts I made by accompanying Joan to several other events that Horace either hated or was unavailable for, and even contacts with actors from various productions who were at first somewhat surprised by my relationship with Joan and Horace, but then became interested. After a year, I was going to events every other week or so with one lady or another, sometimes with absent husbands or boyfriends, sometimes with reluctant ones. I seemed to have a good reputation because no more than a handful of husbands or boyfriends insisted on interviewing me before I took their women to the theater, art gallery, or sometimes even to a charity ball. I think I was popular because I always acted like a gentleman, never took money but was happy just to have the event paid for, and never said anything bad about anyone. The women were usually between the ages of 30 and 70, and most were rich or had rich boyfriends. My particular hobby was the best thing that could have happened to someone like me. I had no problem keeping my sex life separate, and did have some enjoyable, but rather short, sexual relationships with women my age during this time. I had been happily and successfully pursuing my hobby for almost 2 years when an important event occurred. The husband of a new potential client called me. He was the first person in over a year who wanted to meet me. His name was no joke Guido Rixai, and when we met at a local Italian restaurant, he was wearing a black shirt and a white tie under his jacket. Guido was pleasant, but definitely made it clear that he was not to be trifled with. This was confirmed by the subordinate attitude of the restaurant staff. It was clearly a serious interview where he asked questions that were often embarrassing, inappropriate, or strange, including, "Do you like men? What do you like about opera and musicals? Have you ever had sexual contact with someone you accompanied?" etc. I remained calm during the interview, answered all his questions honestly, and then surprised him by asking him several questions, including what business he works in, why he is so concerned about my life, what his relationship is with his wife, etc. I was very pleasant and respectful in asking these questions, but also serious. Although I was sure he was lying when answering some of my questions, I think he actually gained some respect for me because of the questions I asked. I secured his respect by telling him a story. "Let me tell you a story about a friend of mine that will explain how I behave, Guido. My friend had an unfaithful wife. He never bothered to divorce her. He just disappeared one day. However, before he disappeared, he knocked out his lover with his wife, and then burned down his house. I always respected him for that. Traitors are bastards," I said with a completely serious face, before smiling broadly at the end. Guido laughed heartily, patted me on the back, and said, "My wife Gabriella wants to go to the opera in a week on Saturday. Are you free to accompany her? If you can confirm right now that I'm needed, then yes, I smiled. But I'm expecting another offer soon, so I need confirmation now. To be clear, I'm not taking money. I'm expecting transportation to be paid for, drinks and a show, and she will be returned in the same condition in which she left. Agreed. This brought about another laugh, a firm handshake, and a mutual deal. When I picked up Gabriella Rixai in the limousine I had rented, I was surprised by her appearance and behavior. She couldn't have been more than 30 years old. Guido was probably in his mid-40s, and she was dressed provocatively. She was definitely of Italian descent, although clearly American, short, thin, and, apart from her clothes, unremarkable, at first sight. Plus, she looked sullen. I introduced myself pleasantly, helped her into the limousine, and tried to make light conversation. Her responses were either angry or dismissive. For the first time in my career, I was experiencing discomfort, so I took the bull by the horns, just like I did with that asshole. Look, Gabby, I said in a stern tone, suspecting that she hated being called Gabby. My only desire is to have a nice evening at the opera. If something happened today and you're mad as a snake because of it, why don't we cancel it? We can tell your husband that we just have a personality clash and go our separate ways. I always got along with everyone when I went to the opera, theater, or art gallery, but there was always the first time. If you're some kind of pain in the ass, let's turn around now, and I won't even charge Guido for the limo. This caught her attention. She hissed something in Italian. I was far from fluent in Italian, but I studied it for a couple of years in college, and one of my roommates was Italian, so I knew some salty expressions. I'm not an asshole, you are, I responded to her Italian tirade in my not very good, but clearly understandable Italian. Her eyes opened wide. Then she frowned for a minute or two. I interrupted her state with a question in half Italian and half English. Shall we turn around or watch the new diva play the role of Violetta in La Traviata? A minute after my question, her demeanor softened. I will suppress my anger. Let's enjoy La Traviata, she answered half angrily. The rest of the conversation in the limousine was about what we both liked about opera, operas we'd seen in the past, who our favorite performers were, etc. By the time intermission came, Gabriella was really nice, sipping a glass of white wine, and I was enjoying soda. After Violetta realizes that she will not survive and dies, Gabriella's emotions mirror Violetta's condition. When the curtain fell, Gabriella had tears in her eyes. I comforted her by squeezing her shoulder, and she smiled at me through her tears. After the performance, Gabriella surprised me again by wanting to go to a nightclub. Guido gave me a curfew until 1 a.m., so I agreed. Gabriella was a completely different person in the nightclub. It was there that I first noticed that she had that elusive factor that, for lack of a better term, is often called that factor. In my experience, some women have that factor because they are cheerful and optimistic, and their demeanor is contagious and makes the people around them more cheerful and optimistic. In other women, it simply cannot be properly determined. It is something that transcends their looks and makes them incredibly sexually attractive without having physical characteristics that a particular man might idealize. As the evening went on, I realized more and more that Gabriella was incredibly seductive. It got frustrating when our last dance was slow, and despite my best efforts, I became aroused as we moved in unison across the dance floor. I hoped she didn't notice. In the limo on the way back, Gabriella was silent for a few minutes, and then interrupted me when I started to say something. Kevin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to say something. I'm sorry for my dark mood when you picked me up, but I was angry at Guido for simply telling me that he had arranged for someone to take me to the opera, so I wouldn't bother him with it anymore, and completely ignoring my experiences. When you arrived, I barely knew your name, let alone anything else. I'm sorry I took it out on you. I smiled widely. Apologies are accepted. I would react the same way if I was in your situation, I chuckled. I had a great time, she continued, clearly serious. Me too, best time, I replied, causing her to blush slightly. When we returned to her house, almost a mansion, I insisted on walking her to the door and meeting Guido if he was home. She opened the door with the key and called Guido. He and two associates emerged from what I thought might have been a library or home office. I greeted him warmly. "Guido, thank you for allowing me to accompany your charming wife to the opera. It was a wonderful performance, and I thank you for allowing me to enjoy something that I could not have afforded myself. As promised, I'm returning her before curfew and in exactly the same condition as she was in when she left," I said, pronouncing the last phrase with a laugh. Guido laughed too, introduced me to his two associates who looked like actors from one of the Godfather movies, and then I said goodbye, leaving both Guido and Gabriella with smiles on their faces. I don't know exactly how Gabriella got my phone number, but she called me the next day and thanked me for the most enjoyable experience I've had all year. Fortunately, she could only speak for a few minutes, because our conversation caused me some confusion. After a night with Gabriella, on my next romantic date, I fucked my drunken lover with a passion I hadn't felt since my best moments with Jill. Unfortunately, the passion was caused by thoughts of Gabriella, which bothered me when I remembered it the next morning. Fortunately, my companion did not notice anything, but simply praised me for an unforgettable performance. After I dropped my date off the next morning, I promised to put Gabriella out of my mind. "She's not really that special or sexy," I told myself disingenuously, "and she's dangerous," which was certainly true. My efforts to rid myself of thoughts of Gabriella lasted a month until Guido called me again and asked me to take Gabriella to a social event at a club of which he was a member, since he would be away and she was one of the organizers' events. I pretended that I might be conflicted, but in the end I half-heartedly agreed. He seemed very pleased. "A happy wife means a happy life," was the hackneyed phrase with which he ended the conversation. The country club experience with Gabriella was excruciating. Not only did she have that factor with the accompanying sexuality, but with a slight, she looked amazing with her makeup and hairstyle. Everyone I was introduced to seemed to know about my relationship with Gabriella, and a couple of the women even asked about the details of my profession. I behaved completely all evening, including staying away when the band played slow songs. I noticed two guys who looked out of place at the event and seemed to be subtly paying special attention to Gabriella and me. I was sure that these were Guido's spies. They would only have a positive report. I made a big impression on Gabriella and the other people on the organizing committee by helping with cleaning that the staff wasn't required to do, including carrying items to some of the committee members' cars. Gabriella was very friendly on the way to her house. When we got there and I walked her to the door, she said, "Can you take me to see Hamilton on Saturday the 12th? I don't know why Guido doesn't want to go, but I can't miss it." Sure, okay," I replied, stuttering. "Why don't you pick me up in your car? We don't need a limo or a driver," she said with what I swear was a flirty look. Okay, sure," I replied, stuttering again. She hugged me from the side and then disappeared inside. After another epic session of self-pleasure that night, the next day I soberly admitted to myself that I was beginning to obsessively think about Gabriella. I pulled out my cell phone at least a dozen times over the next 10 days to call Gabriella and cancel my trip to see Hamilton. Each time I either chickened out or sighed in defeat, turning off the phone without making a call. Finally, the evening of the play Hamilton arrived. I pulled up to Rick's house in my humble blue Honda Civic and walked up to the door. Gabriella opened the door herself, dressed and made up so impressively that she could excite a eunuch. I stuttered. "You look very beautiful, an underestimation of the year." "Thank you," she smiled. "Is Guido here?" I asked. "No, he left. I promised to call him at intermission, but there is no curfew today," she said with another flirtatious sparkle in her eyes. It was hard for me not to look at her slender hips during the drive to the theater and at the performance, but I still enjoyed it. During intermission, I bought us a glass of wine while she called Guido. When she returned, she said, "The obligation is fulfilled," then drained her glass and took my arm to lead her back to our seats. After the performance, which we both really enjoyed, we went backstage as I had received a pass through Joan Green. We talked to the actors who played King George, George Washington, and Eliza Hamilton, and by the time we left, there were hardly any other cars left in the parking lot. As I held the passenger door open for Gabriella, with a most devilish smile I had ever seen up close, she muttered, "I had a great time. Thank you, Kevin," and then kissed me on the lips. As she sat in the front passenger seat of my Honda, desire overwhelmed me. I pulled her out of the car without hitting her head on the roof and planted the most passionate kiss on her lips while caressing her ass. She didn't resist. When we broke the kiss, she had a look that said, "I know what you want." I didn't disappoint her, saying, "I have to have you," kissed her passionately again, and then helped her into the car. Almost without saying a word, we drove the 17 minutes to my apartment. Almost the only words I uttered the whole way were, "Please don't show off your gorgeous thighs, I'll crash the car." When we got to my apartment, in the ultimate cliched act, I carried her over the threshold into my bedroom, thankfully nearly spotless, because when I try to take my mind off something dangerous like the thought of sleeping with a married siren on a racketeer, I clean my home. I found that the fastest speed two smartly dressed people could take off their clothes without tearing them was about 25 seconds, at least according to my watch that night. Gabriella was even more seductive naked than in clothes, an order of magnitude more. After we kissed passionately and felt each other's hands, I gently laid her down on my bed. We had sex. The rest of the night until the morning continued with erotic and pleasant conversations interspersed with sex. Eventually, we fell into a deep sleep, our bodies intertwined. I woke up to soft lips kissing mine. "Wake up, sleepyhead," Gabriella purred. "It's 6 a.m. and I need to get home before Guido's thugs come." "Can't you stay forever?" I muttered. "I need a few more nights like this to be sure," she giggled. I tickled her, and she jumped out of bed and ran to the shower. I barged into the shower and soaped each other up, wanting to have sex, but our body parts were too sore for that. I guess we should have washed up faster, because when we pulled up to her house, we saw a black SUV in front of it. "Damn," Gabriella muttered. "This is one of Guido's thugs. They can't see me with you. We're in trouble." I thought quickly. I definitely didn't want to end up on the bottom of the ocean with cement boots or for Gabriella to get hurt. "There's a Walmart nearby." I turned in the opposite direction. "Have you ever jogged?" "I exercise a lot, although Guido doesn't like it when I run around without a guard in the car," she replied. "Well, you were running today," I laughed. At Walmart, I bought her shorts, a t-shirt, a sports bra, sneakers, a small fanny pack, and a bottle of water. "What is the water for?" she asked. "You should look sweaty," I replied. She changed clothes in my car while I held back all my strength not to attack her again. Once she was dressed, we drove up to her house, about 500 meters away. She got out of the car, I sprayed her with water, simulating sweat pretty well, then I handed her the keys, wallet, and cell phone, which she put in a pouch on her belt. "I will find a way to give you back your purse and clothes," were my last words as I kissed her. Then she almost ran towards the house. I left there, drove home, and fell on the bed. I quickly fell asleep, completely absorbed in two thoughts. The first, this was the best experience of my life. The second is, I'm a dead man when Guido finds out. When I finally got up around 1 p.m., I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Even though it was probably a promotional call, I answered with an enthusiastic hello. "Hello, Cupid, this is Aurora," followed by laughter on the phone. "Gabriella, what phone are you calling from?" "The new burner phone I just bought to communicate with my lover. That's you, by the way," she laughed. "What happened when you got home?" Two idiots were eating donuts in an SUV. I made fun of them by saying, "Are you all suddenly cops? Why donuts?" They thought it was funny, but then video said, "Miss Gabriella, you know that Guido doesn't like it when you run around alone." I replied, "I woke up at 6 o'clock with full energy because the party last night went so well and there was no one around and I needed to move. Don't worry, I had my cell phone in my belt pouch and there were no robbers this early. Take your donuts inside and I'll make you two some coffee," Gabriella laughed. "So they didn't suspect anything?" I asked. "Nothing. especially when I told them I was going to wash the sweat off of myself after I made them coffee. She laughed. We chatted for a few more minutes, then she said, "Kevin, I need to see you. Meet me at Crossgate Mall near Victoria's Secret at 3:30, okay?" "No wild horses can hold me back," I replied. At the mall, she gave me my own burner phone, and we entered each other's numbers into our phones. "We need rules so we don't get caught because I need more of you," she giggled. "No messages unless you pretend it's a Chinese restaurant dialing the wrong number, no texts, just short conversations to set up appointments." We discussed other precautions until she said, "This should be enough. If we come up with something else along the way, we'll add it." "There's one more thing," I said. With complete seriousness, I continued. "If Guido finds out, we need to minimize the damage you suffer. Tell him that I drugged you, took you by force, and now I'm blackmailing you, threatening to give him a sex tape and post it on the internet." "You'll be dead," she said, almost sobbing. "Not if you text me, 'Your order is ready.' I can leave the city in less than half an hour. I'll prepare everything in advance," I replied. "We'll talk about it when we meet for lunch at the Hilton on Wednesday," she smiled. Since Gabriella didn't work, and I had flexible work hours as long as I fulfilled my duties, we had many days together. It was almost impossible to believe, but the sex got even better as we got to know each other's bodies and desires more. I was in love from the first night we spent together, and all our contacts after that increased the depth of my feelings for her. We took many precautions, such as checking her car for electronics whenever we met at a location within a mile of where we planned to spend the day, using disguises and never disrupting our communication system or showing public displays of affection. Since we had a lot of sex and loved 3 to 5 times a week, when I took her to a play or exhibition at Guido's insistence about once a month, we hardly touched each other. I spotted what I thought were spies many times at various events, but they never had anything suspicious to report to Guido. However, my trips to the theater made me more confident that I was in love with Gabriella because we had almost as much fun dressed as we did undressed. Of course, all good things come to an end. I still don't know how Guido found out. I guess we got lazy and didn't check Gabriella's car for GPS or other electronics every time, but one Tuesday I was late to meet Gabriella at a motel we only used once. I was talking to Joan Green about something very important to her, and I couldn't interrupt her. I was about 3 blocks from the motel when a message came through my burner phone. "Your order is ready." I should have turned around immediately, but wanted to make sure it wasn't a scam, so I parked in the Burger King parking lot about a block from the motel and headed to the lookout point. I saw 2 black SUVs in the motel parking lot, one on either side of Gabriella's car, and I thought I saw video. I wasn't going to find out the details. Luckily, I was well prepared for this eventuality by using my real birth certificate in the name of Tom Simpson and my social security card to obtain a driver's license and even a passport in that name. I withdrew most of the funds from my bank account and put the cash in my safe along with all the important documents. I drove home to pick up the last of my things. Most of what I needed was in the bump bag in my office. After getting everything I needed, I told the manager I was leaving, gave him a fake mail forwarding address in Weymouth, Massachusetts, and $200 in cash, asking him to reluctantly give this address to any big guys who ask me. Since my apartment was a month-to-month rental, and they could keep my deposit and give my furniture to Goodwill, I left. As I was leaving the manager's office, I looked out the front window and saw a black SUV pull up. Luckily, I parked the car in the back, anticipating just such a situation. I slipped out the back door and left before Guido's thugs got to my apartment or manager's office. At the office, I purchased a one-way plane ticket to Boston using a credit card, handed HR my resignation letter, saying I had a family emergency and probably wouldn't be returning, grabbed my emergency bag, and walked out the high-rise service entrance, buildings where he worked. I parked the car in the back and gave the janitor in charge of the loading dock $50 for permission to leave the car there. I then drove to the bank, collected the contents of the safe, and drove to the car market 500 yards from the bank, which I had previously scouted. I sold my car for cash, signed the paperwork as Kevin Harris, and drove to another car market across the street, bought another car in the name of Tom Simpson, then took all the luggage from the first lot and drove in the opposite direction from Boston. Along the way, I closed one of my 2 credit cards, the one with no debt, and as soon as I paid off the other, I'll close that one too. I called Joan Green and my boss from my regular phone to express my condolences about my hasty departure, then removed the SIM card and threw it out the window. I'll recycle the phone when I get to my destination. I'll keep the disposable phone for now because I turned off GPS on it a long time ago. I was hoping Gabriella could play out the drugging and blackmailing scenario. We worked out the details, and given how smart and dramatic she is, I had no doubt she could pull it off. About a month after I, Tom Simpson, arrived in the new city, using the same procedure I used to get a new job when I changed my name from Brandon Bolter to Kevin Harris, I got a job and rented a modest apartment. Then, changing my voice, I called Gabriella and Guido's house from a burner phone with an area code far from my current location. One of the thugs answered. Trying to sound as stupid as possible, I said, hi, I have an order for a rocking chair to be delivered to, 18220 Marston. The order is placed for Gabriella, Rixay, or something like that. I need to arrange delivery. Is Miss Rixay at home? She doesn't exist, was the rude answer. Please, man, give her a message. Call XXXXXXXXXX and ask for Bruno so I can deliver the order. I repeated the number and Bruno, and it looked like the thug had written down the information. I knew Gabriella would realize it was me and hoped she would get the message. About 2 hours later, I received a call on my new burner phone. I saw Gabriella's home number on the call ID. In case the phone was tapped, I answered in my stupid voice. Bruno is listening. You called me. This is Gabriella Rixay. Yeah, I have an order to deliver a rocking chair, and I need to know when to deliver it, I said. In a quiet voice, Gabriella said, This is a gift for my husband. I cannot speak at the moment. Well, call me at the number that guy gave you, this number, when you can talk, and we'll arrange delivery, I replied. Okay, I'll call tomorrow, Gabriella whispered. She called me from a payphone 2 hours after that. After exchanging expressions of affection, she told me that she had successfully enacted the scenario. Guido beat her a little for not telling him, but it wasn't too serious. When he asked if she had warned me, she categorically denied and gave him her phone. She told him that I apparently saw the subs when I pulled up and drove away. He believed. Now, how should we meet? She asked. Buy another burner phone and give me the number. I'll call you when I can pick you up, and we'll agree on a meeting place. Flying in an airplane is too dangerous, I said. Fine. How much time? No more than 2 weeks, I replied. One more thing, as we discussed while planning for this situation, if you can obtain documents or records related to Guido's illegal activities, you can get into the witness protection program and be placed with me. I already have half of what I need, and I'll get the rest later, she giggled. I love you, and I love you more, lasted about 30 seconds before we passed out. 11 days later, I arranged to meet Gabriella at a highway parking lot about 20 miles from her home. She got there in an Uber only after I called and said she was already there. Wearing a wig and glasses, after a passionate kiss, I unloaded my things from the Uber, but didn't start loading them into my car until the Uber drove away. We drove about 60 miles before we stopped at a motel and had crazy sex. It was even better than I remembered. I never wanted to be apart again. My new home was 700 miles away, but taking turns driving, we got there in 12 hours. I rushed home from work every day, and in 2 weeks we tried to make up for the lost 2 months. Waking up in the middle of the night for 2 weeks straight to have sex with a goddess was the best experience of my life. In addition to documents that could send Guido and his accomplices to prison for many years, the cunning Gabriella brought with her $125,000 in cash. This money went towards a new apartment, a car for her, and other luxuries and necessary things. Once we transitioned from acting like newlyweds to being a normal, sexually active and motivated young couple, I contacted my witness protection handler for advice and went to the local FBI office. The FBI showed great interest. Subsequent legal proceedings are too boring for. Story on a sex site. Suffice it to say that after the presentation of documentary and audio evidence, as well as the expected testimony of Gabriella, Guido and 4 of his thugs pleaded guilty to racketeering and other crimes for reduced sentences and received 10 to 12 years each in federal prison. I learned from court records in the state where I lived with Jill that she was granted a divorce on grounds of abandonment. There was no record of her remarrying, although she was presumably still living in the area. The FBI was very grateful for Gabriella's helped her get a divorce, and included her in the witness protection program. We got married as soon as her divorce was finalized. Her name is Gina Simpson now. We have 3 kids, and living in witness protection with a goddess like her is a lot more fun than it was when I was a kid. Who would have thought that Kevin Harris' crush could turn into a life of bliss for Tom Simpson? Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.